Welcome to Adjusted Reality, a podcast series trusted by the adjusted and brought to you by the Foundation for Chiropractic Progress, where we learn from athletes, celebrities, influencers, and healthcare professionals about how to optimize health in a fun, relatable way. Join me, Dr. Sherry McAllister, as I speak with functional medicine practitioner, chiropractor, and author, Dr. Stephen Hussey. Dr. Hussey attained both his Doctorate of Chiropractic and Master's in Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine from the University of Western States in Portland, Oregon. He is a health coach, speaker, and the author of 2 books on health: The Health Evolution, Why Understanding Evolution is the Key to Vibrant Health, and Understanding the Heart, Surprising Insights into the Evolutionary Origins of Heart Disease and Why It Matters. Dr. Hussey guides clients from around the world back to health by using the latest research and health-attaining strategies. Now, in his downtime, if there is such a thing for him, he likes to be outdoors, play sports, read, write, and travel. Welcome to the show, Dr. Hussey.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's really important in this day and age to have topics that are both current and important. And this one hits both of them. And as we have gone through a pandemic and we have seen some very unfortunate outcomes, the heart really gets to the matter of it. And there's no pun intended in that. The heart is one of the most vital piece of organs we have in our body, and we need to understand it. So that, I think, with your latest book, is so very important. And before we get started, I'd like to actually ask, what enticed you to dive into this topic out of all the healthcare topics out there?
A logical question, because, as a chiropractor, people wouldn't think that, I'd be that interested in heart disease and heart health, or that would be something that I've spent so much time researching. Just like most people in this space, it's my passion for health and especially the heart came from my own health journey. When I was a kid, at a very young age, I was diagnosed with a lot of inflammatory conditions. I had allergies and asthma. I used to break out in hives all over my body, just giant red, spots, and had IBS, and ultimately ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes at the age of 9. And, so my parents and I were kind of, reliant on the world of Western medicine to help me manage those conditions and get, quote unquote answers about them. And, it wasn't until college that I started realizing that the way I lived my life had a direct impact on my ability to manage these things. And I found it curious that, a physician growing up had ever told me that. And I'm happy to say that, all those conditions that I had as a child are pretty much gone, aside from the type 1 diabetes, which is kind of collateral damage from that inflammation. But I also recognized, as I was going in and out of endocrinologist's office, throughout my childhood, that there's a lot of, posters on the walls and doctors were concerned about different things like my kidneys or my eyes or neuropathy or things like that. And when I ask why, they say, oh, well, you're heavily predisposed to vascular disease, cardiovascular type disease. And so for most of my adult life, I've been, looking into that throughout my medical education and master's degree. And then my own independent research, I've been looking into, the heart and heart disease, trying to prevent the thing that I'm so heavily predisposed to as a type 1 diabetic. And a lot of what I found was very contrary to what I'd been told or taught about the heart. And so, I started sharing that kind of stuff, the stuff that I'd found on social media about maybe 5 years ago or so. People seemed to like it, and it ultimately ended up as this book. And so that's where we are today.
Outstanding. Well, you picked a very important topic, and it does make sense based on your background and the history that you've already gone through, that heart disease is a concern. And I'd like for you to share with us in a very kind of simple explanation a little bit more about what is heart disease?
Yeah. So I guess, you can categorize it in different ways. There's like heart failure as one kind of big category where the heart is not, quote unquote, pumping the blood like it's supposed to, though. That's kind of a misnomer, as we'll learn. There's, cardiac arrest or myocardial infarction, which are two different types of, what are kind of termed heart attacks. One having to do with an arrhythmia of the heart and a pretty intense arrhythmia, and another having to do with like, a blockage in an artery sometimes, although that's another myth, is that all heart attacks are not caused by blockages of arteries. And then there's like vascular disease, like atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, things building up on the lining of the arteries. And then, I kind of as a fourth one, there's like different arrhythmias like AFib and things like that. So there's different kind of categories of heart disease. But when you say heart disease, it kind of lumps them all, into one category, when in reality they're quite different things, or they can be quite different things that are all caused by generally the same things, but they're quite different processes in the body.
It is very interesting. And I'd like to kind of dive into, when you're looking at heart disease, do you see a pattern over the years that you've been looking at this as to age? Has age become a predisposing piece to it, or are we starting to see younger and younger adults get heart disease and issues surrounding that? What's your research telling you?
We tend to see, I guess, heart disease more, I guess it's picked up more as we age, but that could just be because people go to doctors more as they age. There are things like I talk about in my book, like these three imbalances in the body that happen that pretty much drive, I think, all chronic disease. But, in the book specifically, I'm talking about heart disease, and that is, poor metabolic health or insulin resistance, which is the characteristic of type 2 diabetes. It's inflammation and oxidative stress, which are different things, but they kind of cause the same issues in the body. And then there's imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. And so, that's the system in our body that's perceiving our environment and telling your body if you're in a safe or threatening environment. And if it's imbalanced, you can think you're in a threatening environment too often, and that can cause different physiologic imbalances in the body. And so those three things, I think, are what drive heart disease, and those things increase as we get older. However, we are seeing these things in much younger populations now. And we're seeing, obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes in much younger people. We're seeing people who have lots of inflammation and oxidative stress, and we're seeing lots of young people who are completely stressed out and have the pretty extreme imbalance in their autonomic nervous system. And so that's why we're seeing heart disease earlier and earlier. There's people find it surprising, but, heart attacks are not just for the elderly. They happen in young people too, more often than we think. It can be more prevalent as we age, but, for reasons I think I explained in my book, it's happening in younger populations too.
Sure. And it does make sense because we have been through a very extraordinary time. We've, in the last 20 years, have increased our technology usage, which puts us at, unfortunately, a more sedentary lifestyle. And with that, we tend to, while sitting, and many will watch the news and they'll have, maybe the bowl of popcorn or something to munch on, and they're not getting up and being as active. Plus, you add the stress of life, of business, and we've kind of hit this unfortunate economy right now that has put us into an inflammatory situation, from our pocketbook at the gas station to the grocery store. So those three areas that you covered is part of the imbalance of where you would start with the potential risks that put your heart at that place where it could be damaged and can therefore no longer function appropriately. And when I was looking deeper into it, this might surprise some of our listeners, and I'd like you to really expand on it a little bit. In the book, you talk about how the heart is actually not the main mover of blood. in the body. And I know many times the body, in most of your younger years, you said the heart is the main mover. So I think it's important that we kind of talk a little bit more about this. Can you tell us what is the main mover and why it's significant for our listeners to really understand?
Yeah. Yes, this is one of the most striking things I came across when, in my research, was that the heart is, there's a large body of evidence that suggests the heart is not the main mover of the blood. We think of it as this forceful, contracting, pumping organ that's like this pressure propulsion pump sort of thing, where it's forcefully moving blood through the chambers of the heart and out into the arteries, and that moves it throughout the entire body. Which, if you look at the physics of it, if you look at the hydrodynamics and the physics aspects of that, it's impossible for a heart the size of ours to move the blood throughout the entire body. There's just no way it could create enough force to do that. And, lots of times people who are medically trained will say, yeah, but there's movement of muscles that helps the blood flow. And there's one-way valves in the veins that prevent blood from going backward. And even with those things, it would be physically impossible for the heart to keep the blood moving. Now, the heart does do some pumping, but it's no more than enough to kind of move the blood through the chambers of the heart and maybe through the aorta. But other than that, there's no way that it could move the blood around on its own. And so that begs the question of, how does the blood move and why is the heart there? What is it? And so to understand how the blood moves on its own, we have to understand some unique aspects of water. Okay, so water is this unique liquid that can actually hold energy. And infrared light is one of the main forms of energy that it holds. And when it holds energy and it gets next to a water-loving surface, a hydrophilic surface, it actually structures itself into what's been called the fourth phase of water, or structured water, or exclusion zone water. It has different names. And so it just so happens that the lining of the arteries and veins, and the lining of our lymphatic system, and the lining of our, where the cerebrospinal fluid is all hydrophilic surfaces. And so when water, which the blood is about half water, gets next to those surfaces, it structures itself. And the way that it does this, without getting into the technical, chemistry of it, the way that it does this actually creates an energy gradient. And so the structured water on the lining of the artery is very electronegative. And the hydrogens that have been cleaved off from the water that are in the middle of the artery or the vein becomes very electropositive, and that creates like a kind of like a battery, and that actually creates blood flow. And this is all coming from the work of Gilbert Ling in the past, but most recently Gerald Pollack at the University of Washington, and they've shown that this happens. You put a hydrophilic tube in water and you put energy into the system, and the water will start to flow with no pump whatsoever. It will just start to flow on its own, and it'll continue to flow as long as energy is put into that system. And they've shown that this does happen in chick embryos, that when they stop the heart beating, that the blood continues to flow in the arteries, and especially if they put radiant energy into the system. So this is how the blood is more or less moving throughout the body. And so that should hopefully make people think, okay, well, how do I, get energy into the body so that it creates this flow? And we'll talk about that. So yeah, that's pretty much how the blood's moving on its own. And so then the question is, well, what is the heart and why is it there? And so there's two reasons the heart is there. There's two kind of jobs that it does. One is that it actually functions more like a hydraulic ram. Well, two hydraulic rams put together, like the right atrium, the right ventricle, and the left atrium, and the left ventricle are each hydraulic rams, and they're kind of next to each other. And I didn't know what a hydraulic ram was when I first heard the term. I had to go look it up on YouTube and figure it out. So people are welcome to do that. But it's basically a type of quote unquote pump that works only when fluid is flowing into it. So usually it'll be placed lower down than like a reservoir, and the water from the reservoir is flowing into it. And it uses a series of kind of pressure changes and chambers and things like that. And it moves the fluid through it, kind of sort of pumps it a little bit, based on pressure change, based on physics, using no like external energy source. It's just using physics and buildup of pressure and release of pressure. And so that's what the heart is this, that it's just two hydraulic rams put together. And in my book, I kind of detail the, congruent structures between a hydraulic ram and one half of the heart. And the heart does do some contracting. We see that visibly. We can see the heart contracting. And the reason that it does that is because if you look at the muscles of the heart, it's actually one big band of muscle that's wrapped around itself. And so when the heart is contracting, it's actually spiraling the blood. And if this happens in the presence of oxygen, which there's always oxygen present in the blood, even in the venous blood, then it actually energizes the water so that when it does get out into the periphery where the arteries and the veins, it can actually structure itself onto the lining, and that can promote blood flow. So in a way, the heart is responsible for the movement of blood, just not in the way that we thought. So the heart is this vortexing hydraulic ram that energizes the blood. And then, so that's one, reason the heart is there. The second is quite interesting, and it kind of flips things on its head. The heart is actually responsible for slowing the flow of blood in times of exertion. And there's lots of research on this. What creates blood flow is tissue demand. And so if we're exercising really hard and our tissues are demanding lots of oxygen and nutrients in the blood, then all the blood, or lots of it, flows over to the arterial side. And if the heart wasn't there to stop the flow of blood and halt it a little bit, delay it a little bit, then all the blood would go over to the arterial side and it would cause the venous side to collapse. Which would result in death. We could not maintain pressure between the two systems, the two sides. And so the heart is there to actually slow the flow of blood. And, in endurance athletes, you see this, see sometimes the heart muscle gets stronger and it gets bigger. And they used to think that was because the heart's really efficient at pumping blood, but it's not really pumping blood. What it's doing, it's more efficient at stopping this tremendous flow of blood coming into the heart. And that's why the muscles get bigger, because it's kind of like that back jam where the blood's flowing in. That's why the muscles get bigger, which kind of throws everything on its head. But it's really, really important to understand this, and to understand that we may have misunderstood what the heart is and why it's there, especially for something like heart failure. Because if you're blaming the heart for heart failure for not doing its job of pumping blood, but what if that wasn't its job to begin with? Then we have to understand that. And the thing that drives all this home for me is when you look at the research on infrared sauna use in heart failure, it is absolutely phenomenal. Patients with heart failure who get an infrared sauna, they get the infrared light that energizes the water in their blood and creates blood flow, which takes pressure off the heart. These people, it's based on the research, I don't understand why there's not infrared saunas in every cardiac rehab center everywhere. Because these patients, their hearts go back to normal size, which, in heart failure, it grows in size and it goes back to normal size. Their ejection fraction goes up, the swelling, like the edema in their limbs, goes down. It's just, they have phenomenal results. And so it kind of drives this whole theory home for me. Like, that's how we create blood flow, is by energizing the water in the blood, take pressure off the heart, because heart failure happens lots of time. The heart is forced to do more pumping than it's supposed to, because these other mechanisms are breaking down. So it's pretty fascinating stuff.
It really is fascinating, because it kind of turns everything that you thought you knew about the heart upside down. And you don't hear a lot about this in your regular daily life, where you as a child were probably told, here's what the heart does and here's how it works. And then you get into your doctorate, if you're going to school, or your bachelor's degree, and they don't really even get into the talk about what the blood does and how important it is, and the energy that actually flows in it. And it kind of brings you back to thinking about Eastern medicine and how they talk about vitality and what vitality really is, and what energy and movement of meridian points in like acupuncture, how that impacts you. So it's almost a full circle of appreciating there's an energy, and that energy, especially as we think of it as water, has a whole impact on how heart health happens. And so I really enjoy this conversation. And I know there is this almost unfortunate conversation that happens when you get into wellness programs where they want to talk about cholesterol, because there is this consumer link to cholesterol and heart disease. So could you explain and talk to us about what is the latest research on cholesterol, and why would it be blamed for heart disease?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the big topic, because of, all the, the headlines about cholesterol. And, in my opinion, I think that this whole cholesterol topic, and even the big focus of diet in heart disease, because of the talk of cholesterol, is a very, very large distraction from the actual causes of heart disease. It has become that. Because everybody wants to talk about diet and exercise, which are important and things we should pay attention to for sure. But especially the aspect of diet and cholesterol has totally taken all the focus away from what we should be focusing on when it comes to heart disease, which is what my book is about, is trying to draw attention to those things. But yeah, so we kind of have to start at the beginning with this, because, how did this happen? Because when you learn how this happened, how this heart disease and atherosclerosis in particular was blamed on cholesterol, you start to realize that it was never really proven to cause heart disease. And so back in the 1950s, well, prior to, like in the 1920s, heart disease wasn't anywhere near the epidemic that we have it today. It was around, and we even see evidence of heart disease in ancient civilizations like the Egyptians and things like that. But it was nowhere near the levels that it is today. And in the early 1920s or early 1900s, the cardiology wasn't even really a thing. It was a few doctors that were interested in the heart, or researchers that were interested in the heart, but cardiology wasn't this big main proponent of medicine that it is today, because heart disease just wasn't that big of a thing. And then in the 1940s and 50s, it started to become more prevalent. And it was this growing disease, and people were kind of freaking out about it. It was all over the news. And then President Eisenhower had a heart attack when he was in office, very famously, and people were just worried about it. And scientists were looking for an answer. And this one scientist named Ansel Keys gave everybody that answer. He was an epidemiologist at the University of Minnesota. And what he did was this type of research called epidemiology, which is the lowest form of research there is, for a reason. And it's a type of research that can only show associations between things. It can't show if one thing is causing the other thing. And so he did what he called his 6-country study, and later he did it with 7 countries, where he looked at the data, and he found that the countries, or these 6 countries that were eating the most saturated fat and cholesterol in their diet, had the highest levels of heart disease. What he didn't tell everyone is that there was data from 22 countries available at the time, and he used the 6 countries that would give him the correlation that he wanted to see. And because he was trying to give people an answer for whatever reason, he did that. So not only was it epidemiology, where it's just looking at observations and drawing, conclusions not based on causation, he also admitted data. He kind of cherry picked the data. And then later in 1957, I think it was, 2 other scientists repeated that study with the data available at the time, using all 22 countries, and they found no correlation between the two. But by that time, the theory had kind of already taken off. And, it was on the cover of Time magazine, the bacon's frowny face with the eggs, and there was a lot of money behind this theory, money from the sugar industry and the grain industry, that wanted this idea that saturated fat was bad for you and cholesterol was bad for you, to be the thing, because then they could, sell more of their foods, and people would, get breakfast cereals and those kinds of things, And so actually what's interesting is that it's probably one of the most heavily tested theories out there. When they came up with this idea, then they started testing it. And so they did all these studies, which were expensive studies, where they replaced, saturated fat in the diet with unsaturated fat, with margarine and vegetable oils and things like that. And what they found was that the more unsaturated fat that people ate, the more all-cause mortality they had, the more heart disease they had, the more heart attacks they had. And there was like 4 or 5 major studies that all showed the same thing. The more unsaturated fat you ate, the less cholesterol you ate, the more all-cause mortality you had. And what's interesting is in some of those studies, the authors chose not to publish for 14 years after the study was completed. and they publish it. These guys had the clout to publish in the Lancet or the major journals, and they published in small journals that nobody really reads 14 years later. And so when they were asked, so this guy named Christopher Ramsden went back and dug up those studies and everything, and he asked some of the authors why they did that. And they said, well, we didn't get the result we wanted, which is not how science is supposed to be done. So this whole idea that cholesterol and saturated fat are causing heart disease was based on very flawed and cherry-picked science from the get-go, and it was more backed by industry. And so in 1984, they put together this committee to decide, once and for all, is cholesterol good or bad for you? And they incorrectly decided that it was bad for you. And so because of that, they put together these other committees that were supposed to teach doctors how to educate patients on cholesterol and teach doctors how to administer statin drugs, which are cholesterol lowering medications. And so the pharmaceutical companies got wind of this. And so they went in and directly funded these committees, because of what it started out as is that LDL cholesterol should be 250. And then it was like, well, let's lower it to 200. And then it got lowered to 150. And then it got lowered to 100. And now they want it below 100 today. And that was all funded by pharmaceutical companies, the influence on those guidelines, because they had a drug that could lower cholesterol. So the lower the recommendations for cholesterol were, the more drugs they could prescribe. And there's documentation that I cite in my book of this exact thing happening. This is exactly what happened. And then if you fast forward to today and you look at studies about, well, first of all, there's no really direct mechanism of how cholesterol could cause atherosclerosis. And nobody really knows or agrees because, in my opinion, it doesn't. But if you look at, studies of like bigger studies, like also associational studies, they show that people with the highest cholesterol throughout their life have the higher cognitive abilities. They have the lowest all-cause mortality. They have lower infection rates. They have lower cancer, lower heart disease. And those are just associational studies, but it just goes to show we can't really take those studies and draw conclusions from them. But if you look at the studies on, are statins working? Because they're like, aside from pain medications, they're like the number 2 prescribed medication in the westernized world. And if you look at all the data on heart disease rates and is it working? It's not. Lowering cholesterol is not preventing heart disease. Heart disease rates continue to rise. And so to me, it's just been this huge distraction of what actually causes heart disease. And there was actually a study that came out in 2020, just kind of a review of all the literature on saturated fat and cholesterol, that finally admitted that the whole case against it was overblown, that this was not as bad for our health, and that it actually was causing, there's actually some evidence to suggest that it's causing more disease, the avoidance of these fats and cholesterol.
Wow. And as our listeners hear these kinds of things, and I do hope that they pick up the book to kind of learn the research that you just spoke about and how hard it is to stop yourself from going to association to causation, because it's an easy jump, and it's been made multiple times in history. They see something that shows a pattern and they immediately want to jump to, well, that's the cause. And that cause is in fact a problem, because it doesn't necessarily mean we have the answer. And the answer is what we're looking for. I have a famous quote. We call this the Yogi Sherry moment. And it is, the past, a pill for every ill. The future, a doctor of chiropractic to nurture. And that really is where you are right now as a functional medicine practitioner and a doctor of chiropractic. How do these practices play a role in heart health for what you do?
As far as functional medicine and chiropractic, functional medicine in general, just, it's just a more, I guess, broad spectrum look at the body. It's like looking for the root cause of something rather than just identifying something on a blood panel, like quote unquote high cholesterol, and then treating the blood work panel. Because I have a kind of a beef about, a blood work panel or testing, because to think that we can understand, what's going on in the body from one snapshot in time of one tissue in the body is quite short-sighted. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't use blood work for things and look at stuff, but it's never really going to tell you if you're healthy. We should never treat the blood work panel. We should treat the person, which is kind of a functional medicine mentality, is look at the root cause. Unfortunately, sometimes I see functional medicine become take a blood work panel and treat the blood work panel with supplements, which I could argue are better than medications, but that's the same kind of approach as Western medicine, just using different tools, which I don't think is as helpful for the patient. And then as far as chiropractic goes, I wrote a chapter in my book all about chiropractic and heart health. And I intro in that chapter with the whole talk about, how the AMA put together a committee to disband chiropractic in the past and all that, because one of the myths that came from that is that chiropractic causes stroke. And that's a very vascular, cardiovascular type thing that I wanted to address. And it's fascinating when you look at the research, in that basically all the studies on this is where they take a group of people who were diagnosed with stroke at some point and they see what they did. And basically what happens is people start having neck pain or headaches because they're having a stroke. And that's, one of the first signs of strokes. People have neck pain or headaches, and they go to a practitioner of some sort, whether it's their PCP or a chiropractor, which, people would go to either one of those for neck pain and headache. And keep in mind, they're having a stroke at this point. It's just that the practitioner misses it because it's a neck pain and headache. The PCP misses it, or the chiropractor misses it, and some sort of treatment is administered, whether it's whatever the PCP would do or whatever the chiropractor would do. And the likelihood of that patient with neck pain and headache being diagnosed with a stroke later on, like in the emergency room when the stroke gets worse, is exactly the same, whether they went to a PCP or went to their chiropractor. And so I wanted to address that. And there's also studies that show that, with an adjustment, you can't create the tension you would need to cause a dissection, which is, a clot forming that will cause a stroke in the brain. So it's fascinating to look at all that. And then I also, when I look at what chiropractic does and how it's a treatment of, in the evidence, we're very, we have lots of evidence that neck pain, back pain, headaches, and chiropractic is very effective at that, but really we're treating the nervous system. And if you look at one of my foundational pillars of what heart disease is, it's imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, and the ability to have an appropriate stress response and return to normal. And chiropractic is very, very good at helping people restore balance in the autonomic nervous system, which will, prevent heart disease, or I would like to think that it would, even though we can't really say that. We're treating the nervous system. But when you look at what actually causes heart disease, then yes. And so I take it back to in my book, like the three imbalances of heart disease, which are poor metabolic health and inflammation, oxidative stress, and imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. And then I go through the research that shows that chiropractic care, physiologically and clinically, looking at, direct mechanisms and what we see in clinic, can have an effect on all three of those things. And so, can chiropractic help us be a part of heart health in general? Of course, but that's just because it's looking at this whole person approach. It's not just treating your blood work panel or waiting for you to have disease. It's saying, okay, let's prevent these things, these core imbalances in the body that create all disease, and work on those so that you can be a healthier you. And it's what I love to do. It's like, I love to, develop these ideas and then go into the literature and find that it's there. It's just that nobody's talking about it.
That's one of the keys when I start looking at some of the wellness programs in major Fortune 500 companies, is they have the wellness program, and yet they do exactly what you just said. They're treating the blood work. What is a wellness program? Well, we got to figure out, how bad is your diabetes? Does it need insulin? How bad is your cholesterol? Do you need a statin drug? How bad is your nervous system, especially if you have, for example, diabetes and you have a neuropathy? It's not really focused on what we really need to be focused on. And it's one word: you. We need to focus on you as a whole person. Because when you start distracting all of these pieces, the system doesn't work. It's a system. And I think designed to be a system. And when you try to pull pieces apart, it's like patchwork on a raft. You have a hole here. Oh my gosh, we're flooding over here. What do we do next? And that's where the critical component is for a listener today. And I think they're probably listening now thinking one thing is, well, okay, what do I do? How do I lessen my chance of heart disease? And I think, Dr. Hussey, you've done such valuable work, and you've brought up some very important concepts such as association and causation. Can you then tell our listeners, how do they lessen their chances of heart health? And I know you've already written a book on it, but give them something to walk away with and then engage more, that I hope our listeners would be interested in finding out more for themselves.
Sure. So I'll take it back to these 3 imbalances, and I'll go through each one and tell people kind of what they can do, or at least a starting point for each of these imbalances. So the first one is poor metabolic health. And all that means is your body's not able to take the energy that you're consuming and metabolize it in a way that's not harming you. And so that can lead to insulin resistance, which is when your body's not responding to insulin, which is the characteristic of type 2 diabetes. Now, very importantly here, you can be insulin resistant years and years and years before you ever becomes type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes. Before it ever becomes pre-diabetes. It'll show up in your fasting insulin level, because people want to take your A1C and they want to take your blood sugar and they say, oh, that's normal. But how much insulin is your body having to use to keep that normal? Because if it's having to use too much, that's insulin resistance. And so one of the most important markers to take is a fasting insulin level. And most doctors won't take it. Or they don't understand why you would want to take it. They're just waiting for the A1C or the blood sugar to be affected. And so if we want to truly assess metabolic health, we want to look at fasting insulin. And then we also want to look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio, which should be 1.5 or lower. And so the way that we achieve metabolic health is, the one-line answer is eat a whole foods diet. Eat a diet that is not going to have vegetable oils in it. It's not going to have processed sugars or processed grains, or any grains really. I don't think that grains are very well suited for humans to consume. But those 3, if you get those 3 things out of your diet and you stick to whole foods, especially, center your diet around animal foods, which are the most well absorbed as far from a nutrient perspective by our bodies, by human bodies, then you're really setting yourself up for good metabolic health. And it's the processed foods that are driving this, from a metabolic standpoint, that are driving this epidemic of poor metabolic health. So it's really stick to a whole foods diet. And there are many types of diets that could do that. As long as your diet's providing metabolic health and providing you adequate nutrition, then I can't really argue with that diet. The second one, reducing inflammation and oxidative stress. This can be everything from reducing toxin exposure in your life, to reducing stress, to, mitigating your house of mold, to, there's all sorts of things that can cause inflammation and oxidative stress. But oxidative stress, will largely be taken care of for eating a whole foods diet. If we're metabolically healthy, we're going to make less free radicals, which are things that cause oxidative stress. And oxidative stress, if people don't know, it's kind of like rusting of your body, like your body is oxidizing, which is what happens when iron rusts. And so we don't want that, obviously. But a big one here is toxin exposure. So I'll just go through like the 5 main areas that I think we're most commonly exposed to toxins. One is food, whether that's pesticides sprayed onto food, whether it's toxins the plant itself makes, because plants do make toxins, whether it's plastic wrapping, like on the toxic packaging of food, those types of things. So make sure your diet's as clean as possible. Then there's water. Make sure your water is as clean as possible, because tap water can be pretty, and even like plastic bottled water can be pretty toxic these days. So there's that. And then there's air. Obviously, you can't control all the air you breathe when you go outside and everything, but you can control the air in your house somewhat, especially in your bedroom where you spend a third of your life. Like make sure that's pretty clean air. You're not breathing in mold or, different toxins that can, especially artificial fragrances and things like that. No blade plugins, don't do that. Those things can be pretty toxic to us. And then cosmetics, anything you put on your body will get in your body. So make sure you're using clean versions of those, and then cleaning products. Really all you need is some vinegar and some water, maybe some essential oils, and that'll clean things pretty well. You don't need all these toxic chemicals to clean your home, and contribute to that poor air, in the home. So, those are big sources. I mean, all those things may sound like, little things, but when you add them all up and you think about how much we're exposed to every single day, then it's really hard on our body. It can create a pretty big source of inflammation. So, there's that. And then actually one of the biggest sources of inflammation and oxidative stress is psychological stress. And that leads me right into the third imbalance, which is an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. So, I said earlier that this system is perceiving our environment through our senses and telling your body if you're in a safe or threatening environment. And if you're perceiving that you're in a threatening environment, your body's going to react accordingly. And it's going to have a threat response, which in that situation, it's not going to be thinking about digesting. It's not going to be thinking about detoxification or anything, no procreating, no sleeping, no anything like that, because that's not something your body does when it's overwhelmed in this stress response. And humans are interesting in that I'm pretty sure we're the only species on the planet that can think our way into a stress response. And that's where we're seeing this epidemic of autonomic imbalance, where we're having poor stress responses. Like the ability of the body, or the health is the ability of the body to adapt to different situations. And so if we can't adapt to a stress and have an appropriate stress response and come back to normal, that's a problem. And we measure that through heart rate variability, which there are many devices nowadays that people can get to measure heart rate variability and kind of track that. But as far as achieving balance in the autonomic nervous system, it's like one of my favorite things to talk about because it gets into like this quantum aspect of the body, this biophysics side of the body, because we talk a lot about biochemistry, but there's a biophysics to us too. And that's things that help balance the autonomic nervous system are positive social relationships, loving relationships. It's spending time in nature, getting adequate sunlight. It's hearing the right sounds. It's having a proper circadian rhythm, waking up with the sun, watching the sunrise. It's infrared light exposure. It's living in I guess, more in tune with the earth. I would say, like putting your feet directly on the ground. Like all this stuff sounds like woo woo, but it's like every single thing that I've said has a substantial amount of research behind it, showing that it affects our heart rate variability and that it creates balance in the autonomic nervous system. Chiropractic, creates balance in the autonomic nervous system. And then you can go on and on and on about all these things. And if you think about all these things and then you think about the modern way of living and how disconnected from all those things it is, even though we're very connected to other people through technology, we're very disconnected from people from a meaningful social relationship. And I'll add one last thing, because I think it's the most important thing as far as achieving balance. Like when you think about the stresses in your life, it's the research shows over and over again, it's the stresses that make you feel like you're out of control or in an unpredictable situation that are the most damaging to our health. So they did these interesting studies where they asked people how much stress. They went into a big company and they asked people how much stress they had, and then they tracked their health. And the people who were higher up in the company and the people who were pretty low in the company reported equal amounts of stress. But the big CEOs in the company had control of that stress. They were choosing their hours. It was stress. It was like good stress to them. It was like the stress of running a business and opportunity. And the people lower in the company who had unpredictable hours, unpredictable wages, didn't know if their job was secure, things like that, they had the same amount of stress reported, but way worse health outcomes. Because these types of stresses, which makes you think about the past 3 years and how uncontrolled people felt, and how problematic that could have been for society. And the research reflects that as well. So those are the types, if you have to try and mitigate any stresses, like those are the ones you want to focus on, the ones that make you feel like you're out of control or unpredictable situations.
I cannot believe how much information just got jam-packed into the last question. And listeners, it is amazing. And I have to say right off the bat, Dr. Hussey, congratulations on your book. It is a fascinating topic, and I think we're going to have you back. I think that's just going to have to be the way to it. And I often engage my guests by saying, "Would you come back and talk to us more about this?"
I'd love to.
And that's the answer I was hoping you give me. I was in that what we call the not sure category, out of my control, but grateful that you have said that you would come back, because there's so much in this topic that I think we need to explore it more. And especially, you brought up one of the most fascinating topics in my mind, which is the last couple of years. Where have we been? What have we done? How do we continue to move this forward? And you have so much research in your book that I think our listeners would really be grateful to just dive a little deeper into this topic, get the basics down, and then start to discover how they can truly get back to the life that, 100 years ago, it was a little bit less stressful because the outcomes may have been a little bit in their control. Maybe not. It depends on how you look at it. But I would love to dive a little deeper into it. So on behalf of all of our listeners, I want to thank you sincerely for bringing this topic to top of mind and bringing in the importance of what our heart does and why it's so important to protect the vital organ that we have and how our body as a whole works together. So thank you so much for being part of Adjusted Reality today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank you for tuning in to Adjusted Reality as we spoke to chiropractor, functional medicine practitioner, and author, Dr. Stephen Hussey, about his latest book, Understanding the Heart: Surprising Insights into the Evolutionary Origins of Heart Disease and Why It Matters. What happens to alter our health in 3 important ways that he went over: poor metabolic health, inflammation and oxidative stress, and the autonomic nervous system and how it plays a role. Well, we are so delighted that you joined us for this episode. And this podcast, as you know, was brought to you by the Foundation for Chiropractic Progress. As a special gift for listening today, you can visit f4cp.org/health to get a copy of our Mind, Body, Spirit ebook, which focuses on many ways to optimize your health and the ones you love without the use of drugs or surgery. Now, don't forget to subscribe, share this podcast with your family and your friends, rate and review. We can't thank you enough for making Adjusted Reality a podcast that continues to grow and flourish. If you're inspired to learn more about chiropractic, or you'd like to find a chiropractor near you, well, you can visit f4cp.org/find-a-doctor. We appreciate your support and look forward to checking in with you again soon.